Thank you, Kristen, for those slides. It's encouraging to see lots of different types of housing, just like we're going to be talking about tonight. So it's really an honor to welcome you to this forum. I am Hattie Garrett. I'm the mayor of the city of Decatur, and I hope many of you are our residents, but hopefully we have some folks from other areas joining to see what we are looking at in the city of Decatur. I also want you to know that we have knowledgeable panelists that will help us understand the data about the need for finding ways to support and develop opportunities for missing middle housing in the city of Decatur. What we're really looking at is and considering is housing options. We don't have many options currently available. How do we expand those options so that more people can find a place that they can call home in the city of Decatur? I've stated this before, but we have to be bold and intentional in our efforts. It is just not going to happen if we let the status quo continue. We have to be intentional in our efforts to create the change necessary to support our core values in the city of Decatur of diversity and inclusion. And I welcome all of you and thank you for being here. And I'm going to turn it back over to Kristen Allen, who I think has some additional information to share, and then she will introduce our panelists. And again, thank you to our knowledgeable panelists for sharing information with us and then having the opportunity for some discussion at the end. So welcome and thanks for being here.
And thank you, Mayor Garrett, and welcome everyone tonight. My name is Kristen Allen, and I'm a planner with the City of Decatur in charge of affordable housing initiatives. And I was hired specifically to address affordable housing in the city, and I'm also a resident. I've been here for about 20 years, and I have 2 kids that have gone through the City of Decatur school system. And just excited to talk to you tonight a little bit about missing middle housing. And we have a great group of panelists as well to help answer questions that have come in from the community on these proposed initiatives. So I'm going to start by showing everyone a video from the Affordable Housing website just to get us started off.
The Decatur we know and love today is the result of over 4 decades of planning and follow through. And by many measures, a highly rated school system, a destination downtown, a strong real estate market. That work has been successful, but success can be a double-edged sword. With limited land and a desirable quality of life, prices rise, often well beyond the reach of workforce and middle-class people.
We're both Emory professionals. We have a growing family. We're working 40 hours a week and still kind of having trouble finding a location where we can actually buy or purchase in the city of Decatur. We kind of find ourselves renting around the city, but we would love to be, here.
So I teach in City Schools of Decatur. This is my 15th year teaching in the district. I've taught at Oakhurst and now my 5th year at Renfro. I love it here. And I live where I teach. I love living in this community. I walk everywhere. And I ride my bike, but it's difficult. I've lived in several different rentals in the district. I've lived in garage apartments. I've lived in duplexes. I've lived in standalone houses. And every year it is more and more difficult to find something that's actually affordable. And that's actually my current situation right now. We've been living in a rental for about 4 years and recently found out that once again, we have to move.
I have served the community of the City of Decatur for 11 years as an officer. 4 of those years, I was able to rent in the Oakhurst area. After renting for 4 years, my family and I decided we wanted to purchase a home. And as we looked around Decatur, it was obvious to us that we could not afford to live in the city, so we had to look elsewhere. I just believe the fact that I work and serve the community and serve this city, that it is very unfortunate that we're not able to purchase homes in the area in which we serve.
I have lived in Decatur and worked in Decatur for over 25 years. My husband and I have raised our children here. We've grown to love this neighborhood. We really want to stay right in this area. We want to have a little yard, a little dirt to play in. We want to stay close to the neighbors that we are so close to emotionally. And we're getting worried because there just don't seem to be many affordable options that suit our needs.
The residents and staff in the city of Decatur have been talking about the importance of affordable housing for over a decade. And during this time, home prices and rents have only gone steadily upward. This problem is pressing and it's not going away. That's why in the summer of 2019, the city convened the Affordable Housing Task Force and asked us to study the problem and make recommendations about how the city can best address it. Many of these recommendations are focused on our city's neighborhoods and how to make them more economically inclusive.
Historically, traditional neighborhoods have addressed economic diversity with a variety of housing types: single-family homes, duplexes, triplexes, and quads, even granny flats and small townhomes. Decatur's been no exception and has featured many of these through the years, some of which remain. They're what's now called the missing middle, smaller scale buildings distinct from the larger multifamily projects we see downtown and near transit that are compatible with single-family homes. This is Drexel Avenue in Decatur's Lenox Place neighborhood. Walking down it, you'd likely experience it as a pleasant single-family street, but you'd be mistaken, because hidden in plain view among the homes of this quiet 4-block stretch are 40 naturally occurring missing middle housing units at varying levels of affordability. Such integration was once commonplace in Decatur, and the duplexes, triplexes, and quads we see today were all built or retrofitted in years past as a legal and encouraged solution to the housing needs of the day. But in 1988, they were outlawed in response to challenges we now find unfamiliar: disinvestment and absentee ownership. Today, our pressing need for more affordable housing exists in stark contrast to the 1980s. What was once a seemingly practical response to decline now exists as an artificial economic barrier, a new form of redlining that prevents all but the highest income households from living in Decatur's neighborhoods. This need not be our destiny or our legacy. We can choose a different path. Among the many recommendations of the Affordable Housing Task Force report are efforts to once again allow these more inclusive missing middle housing types that were once commonplace in Decatur, with additional housing options scaled comparably to single-family homes, but configured to include smaller dwellings. We can help overcome the policies that have contributed to Decatur's loss of racial and economic diversity. We can create space intentionally for workforce and middle-class people currently priced out of our neighborhoods. In response to the recommendations put forth by the Affordable Housing Task Force, the city is currently at work on a proposed zoning update with the potential to make our neighborhoods the welcoming and economically diverse places we want them to be. To do so, they'll need you, your input, and your support. This is our opportunity to shape our neighborhoods according to our values, where service workers and young couples are just as welcome as those of increased means, where teachers and police officers and freelancers can share the neighborhood with lawyers and investment bankers, and where our long-term residents can downsize to more manageable and affordable space without leaving the neighborhood and the neighbors they've come to love. Let your voice be heard. Learn more, get involved, and encourage our city leadership to make this bold investment in a more inclusive future.
So tonight, with our missing middle forum discussion, we'll discuss two specific recommendations, recommended amendments to the Unified Development Ordinance to reallow the missing middle housing that was just shown in the video in Decatur's neighborhoods. And so what I'll do tonight is start by going through a trajectory of housing in Decatur. I'll talk about our current housing situation, why missing middle is being considered, the recommended policies, questions from the community, and introduce our panelists to go through further questions that have come in through the community. And these questions have been submitted online through the pre-form questionnaire. And if you have additional questions, you can chat them to Angela Threadgill during this presentation. And if we have time, we will address some of those at the end. And if not, I will post them on the website. So first, we'll start by talking about Decatur's trajectory from 2000 to 2020. A lot of people don't know this, but missing middle housing types were actually allowed in Decatur up until 1988. So duplexes were the last type that were allowed, and they were disallowed in 88. And at this time, you cannot build a new duplex, triplex, or quadplex, nor convert your home. Single family homes are the only type of dwelling that are allowed in residential zones in the city of Decatur. So although we see some of these older units around, they're actually not allowed to be built anymore. So the trajectory of Decatur's neighborhoods since around the time this was passed has trended to larger and more expensive homes, families with children, higher incomes, and has trended away from smaller homes and housing diversity. So we've trended away from some of these middle income options and housing for all stages of life, like the 20 to 34 range and older residents. And when you look at the specific trajectory of the housing units in Decatur, you can see where this missing middle has kind of vanished over the years since from 2000 to 2020. So the first line is 1 unit detached, which is a single family home. And if you look all the way to the right side, you can see that from 2000 to 2020, Decatur added 478 single family homes. And then right below that, the 1 unit attached are townhomes. So Decatur added 410 townhomes. At the same time, if you look down at the last row, the 20 or more units, Decatur has also added 1,100 large apartment units. But in the middle, the 2, 3, and 4, 5 to 9, and 10 to 19 units, we've actually lost units. And the missing middle that we're talking about tonight that is in the recommendation is the 2 to 4 unit dwellings, of which Decatur has lost 342 of those. The trajectory also includes a loss of racial diversity. So you can see the change in home ownership rates by race. From 2000 to 2020, we've lost 14.9% of Black home ownership and 22.7% Hispanic. We've also had a loss of income diversity. So this chart talks about the change in income from 2010 to 2020. So 2010 is in the blue and 2020 is in the green. And so you can see at the all of the incomes under $99,999, that population has decreased over time, and the 100,000, 150,000, and 200,000 has increased pretty dramatically, especially at the 200,000 or more. And this is more of a snapshot of this point in time regarding age, but there's also been a loss of age diversity. And this slide is to point out a little bit more of what ages Decatur is attracting and what ages they are not attracting. So I've highlighted the 20 to 24 and 25 to 34, and Decatur is in the blue, Atlanta is in the green, and Metro Atlanta is in the orange. So you can see that Decatur has significantly less of that population in the younger years. And also when you get up to 55 to 85 years and over, that's a smaller population compared to how many people we have from under 5 to 19, and then from 35 to 54. I also wanted to point out the National Citizen Survey. This is something the city of Decatur does every year so that it can see what's, what is doing right and wrong in the community, where improvements can be made, and how Decatur is doing benchmarking to past years. So Decatur ranks very high compared to other cities on quality of life issues. 94% of people would recommend living here of the respondents. 93%, for example, think that Decatur has a great quality of business and service establishments. But where Decatur really has suffered over the years, and this has come out again and again in reports, is the availability of quality affordable housing. You can see that's only at 21%, and it's actually decreased from 2008. It was at 48% then, and now it's down to 21%. It also, the score in the variety of housing options is also pretty low for Decatur at 44%. And this need has come up again and again in reports from 2000 to 2020 about the need for more of a diversity of housing. And specifically in the 2020 Affordable Housing Task Force report was actually put in as a recommendation to reallow this missing middle housing. The strategic plan also shows kind of an evolving vision. So the vision in 2020 has been that Decatur will foster an equitable, thriving, and welcoming community for all today and in the future. So we've shifted from just pushing growing quality of life over time to now that we have this extremely wonderful quality of life, looking around and looking at equity in the city. And this is going to determine what we do will determine what our next trajectory is, from 2020 beyond. So why are we looking at a diversity of housing in residential areas? This map shows all of the R60 and R85 residential parcels in Decatur, and you can see that it's 67% of the community is single family zoning. So all the pink is our single family zoning. And these areas have seen such a high demand and lack of housing diversity, and it's pushed our home prices up. So the average home price was over $700,000 in 2021. Missing middle housing also represents all stages of life. So this is a reason that it was a recommendation for a diversity of housing and people. So we talked a little bit about young people, the millennials and Gen Z, who strongly support missing middle housing. And also AARP is one of the biggest supporters of missing middle housing for older residents. And their website has a lot of different articles and discussions around missing middle housing and how best to add it in communities. We're also talking about workforce housing needs, and this has come up in report after report as well, to enable housing for those who work in Decatur. So over time, we've increased the number of cars coming into Decatur every day, the number of cars leaving Decatur every day. Right now, there are about 7,600 cars entering Decatur every day and about 8,000 leaving Decatur. And so when we think about traffic, I know traffic is one thing that has come up several times in the questions from the community. But when we think about traffic, I think we need to shift that conversation to commute traffic, because we've got to address our commute traffic, which is the heaviest traffic that Decatur has. So workforce housing is one way to address this and to reduce commutes. And on the chart on the left, this also shows up when different communities are looking at greenhouse gas reductions. So there's a big crossover between traffic reduction and greenhouse gas reduction. And I'm pointing out the urban infill bracket, which is the largest recommendation for reducing greenhouse gases. And urban infill is actually adding density within neighborhoods and on vacant lots in communities to bring people closer to work. So we've got kind of that intersection of solving traffic problems and also greenhouse gas reduction and helping the businesses and schools in the area to retain employees. Now I want to point out too that missing middle is just one piece of overall housing goals. So there are tools being put in place to address affordability. And these were all recommendations that came out of the Affordable Housing Task Force report and what I've been hired specifically to start implementing. So one is the Decatur Land Trust, which is a tool for permanent affordability and also to preserve some of our older, smaller homes in Decatur. There's also a home repair program that's being developed under the Decatur Land Trust that could also expand into some of our older apartments and rental units to try to preserve those. We have a housing trust fund that has been gathering money over the last few years, and we're developing policies and procedures of how to best leverage those funds for affordable housing. And we're getting better at our partnerships. So Oak Cottage Court is 6 affordable homes, workforce homes on Commerce that just broke ground a couple of weeks ago. And that is a partnership with a nonprofit developer, ANDP. And one of our panelists, Jim Cheeks, is actually the builder on that project as well. We're also looking at an ADU pilot program. Those were legalized in Decatur back in 2014, and we're looking at a way to pilot them more for affordable housing. And we also have emerging opportunities. So with the missing middle, the way it fits into some of the opportunities, an example would be the house at 600 Commerce Drive that the city is now under contract to purchase. That is one single family home that could turn into a quadplex and could be 4 affordable homes. And there are several of those around the area. So passing this type of policy can actually really help add incremental development and affordable housing options. So what are the exact policy proposals? There are 2 that will be coming before the Planning Commission and the City Commission in the coming months. The first one is just simply to re-allow duplex, triplex, and quadplex construction and home conversions within single-family neighborhoods. It doesn't mean that people have to build them, but they have an option to build them if they want. They could still build a single-family home as well. But any new duplex, triplex, or quadplex would need to fit into the same parameters of a single-family home, meaning the same height, the same size, the same FAR, and the same setbacks. So that's the first, is just to basically allow them, but they have to comply with the same standards of a single-family home. The second is to allow a portion of the parking requirements to be satisfied on street. So a single family home has to have one parking space per dwelling unit. So it has a single family home has to have one. So that would not change with a duplex, triplex, or quadplex. Each dwelling would be required to have one parking space, but half of that would be allowed to be satisfied on street. And it would go through a limited review from the city. And what that means is the city would actually spot check this before it was approved to make sure that parking was actually allowed on that street in front and that there was enough curb frontage space, not including things like the fire hydrant or driveway, for the number of cars requested to park there. And this was really a compromise between people who don't think that the city should be in the business of mandating parking at all because of the effects on climate and the expense for affordable housing, and people who really want to maintain, not have too many spots on the street. So this is really a compromise between those who don't want on-street parking and those who really don't want the city to be enforcing parking at all. These are a couple possibilities that I pulled up. So this house in color is actually a house that was built kind of near where I live a few months ago. It's a kind of a modern, kind of longer skinny house. And so we did a rendering of it to see what that house would look like as a multi-unit house. So this shows how a multi-unit, a fourplex in this case, would have to fit on the same lot, the same size as the house that's there, but you could activate the side of the house for entrances. So this could turn it into a quadplex. So it shows how you have exactly what the single family home looked like, the new development, and what it would look like as a multi-unit and how it would fit into the neighborhood. The two houses to the right are houses in my neighborhood and in Oakhurst that you could see if they had two doors, being either a triplex or a quadplex, and how those designs can actually fit into what new houses look like in Decatur, and the inside would just be changed for the extra units. And then the small house down to the lower left side is someone who approached me who's interested in converting her home to a duplex because she would like to have someone live with her. She's an older person, but wants to stay in her home. And so this type of policy can also help people in that situation. So now I'm going to go through some questions from the community. The first is an impact estimate. And two of the cities that have had this policy implemented the longest are Minneapolis and Portland. And when you compare the number of single family dwellings that each city has with the number of new or converted duplex, triplex, or quadplexes in that city, you get about 0.096% growth. If you look at how many new units were created compared to the number of single family dwellings the city already has. And so if you take that growth percent, what does that equate to in Decatur? It's very general density. So I just want to emphasize that this is most likely around 8 to 12 new units per year, and similar to the growth that Decatur saw in ADUs or granny flats since they were allowed in Decatur in 2014. Over 10 years, this could be around 80 to 120 new smaller missing middle homes scattered throughout Decatur's neighborhoods, but also provide for the opportunities that I talked about for affordable initiatives to come in and try to work with some properties that we have. We've also had a lot of questions about school enrollment. And I went ahead and did a real life projection using multipliers from the City Schools of Decatur. They did a student yield analysis report in 2020. And this created multipliers based on how many bedrooms a place had and what type of housing. So I went ahead and compared if there was a redevelopment of 25 single family lots, or basically tear downs of older single family homes around Decatur, what would that enrollment look like if it was a single family home versus a duplex versus a triplex versus a quadplex? And you can see all the multipliers down below, so I won't go into all of that right now, but this will be recorded if anyone wants to go back and look at it on the website. But the results are, if they were all developed as new single family homes, the estimate from the school would be 14 school-age children. If they were all developed as new duplexes, it would be 18 school-age children, so just 4 more. New triplexes would result in 16 school-age children, and new quadplexes in 13 school-age children. So I just want to point out that smaller units have fewer kids. That's been proven through the school systems. And instead of 25 single-family homes, we could develop 100 quadplexes and have 1 fewer school-age children projected for that. Another question that's come up from the community is the trend of investor-owned homes. And this map is a study from the Washington Post in 2021. And at that time, Metro Atlanta had 25% investor home purchases and was starting to get pretty alarmed about the investor home purchases versus where they were in 2015, which was 12%. Now, Decatur in 2021 had 10% investor home purchases, including Greater Decatur, because you can see that the study is all of 30030, so it includes an area kind of outside of Decatur as well. So we're not seeing the same level of investor home purchases in Decatur that Atlanta is seeing. Some other questions that come up around on-street parking and safety of pedestrians and cyclists. And so I just wanted to point out here that on-street parking can serve as a traffic calming measure. And if you look at this map from the City of Decatur Transportation Plan update from 2018, you see that our neighborhoods where we have on-street parking, and we have had it for many years, are the safest places for pedestrians and cyclists. The accidents occur on roads where the red is bicycle, the green is pedestrian, and the blue are vehicle crashes from that report. So you can see that the cities where we move people through the fastest and our widest roads are where we see the most accidents. So we're really looking at on-street parking as something that's actually beneficial in the neighborhoods and reduces accidents and contributes to safety. There are questions also about the potential impact on city and county services. So just to point out that the City of Decatur charges sanitation fees per dwelling unit. So a fourplex would have 4 times the number of fees. So that's how the city would capture some of that extra work for picking up trash and things for city services. And the county also requires a very extensive permitting process for sewer capacity. And so they'll evaluate any new home or multi-unit, and those would potentially have to pay into a sewer credit bank. And that credit bank goes back to repairing and adding new lines. So that's kind of how DeKalb County works with that. And there would be extra fees, depending on the number of dwelling units to capture that. As far as tax assessment, I've done some spot checks, and the assessments of missing middle housing are similar to those of single family homes. And just to note that rentals are not eligible for homestead exemptions. So rentals actually end up paying more property taxes than single family homes. So what are the next community engagement topics for potential policy reform? There's been a lot of conversation about short-term rentals. This will require a similar process to what we're doing right now with outreach for the missing middle housing. I've started my research on that, and Airbnb and VRBO site searches that I've done, and also some film crew sites have revealed that we believe there are around 15 to 20 short-term rentals in Decatur, which are a mix of apartments, single rooms, homes, and ADUs. So right now we're looking through policy recommendations and policies around the country and researching to determine what's right for Decatur. We'll seek public input for that, and recommendations will be brought to the commission in 2023. As far as the investor-owned housing, we understand that's a concern in the community, and I'm researching policies for those as well if they are needed. As I said, right now it's not really a concern, but we want to be ready if it ever does become a concern. And also people have asked about the preservation of older, smaller homes and existing missing middle, and the Decatur Land Trust, it will probably be the most important vehicle for that. And we also have other programs under review for that preservation. So the next steps after the forum, I will be available to go out for additional in-person sessions for neighbors or groups. So you can email me if you'd like to set that up. I'll also have a table at the book festival October 1st if you want to come talk to me. And we'll be finalizing the recommended proposals and moving toward planning commission and city commission hearings likely to start in fall of 22. And the website is decaturga.com/affordable housing, so you can keep up with everything. So now I'm going to start turning it over to the panelists to answer some questions. And I just want to do a quick introduction of our great group of panelists we have tonight to talk about missing middle. So first we have Joel Dixon, and he is the co-principal of Urban Oasis Development and president of investment partner Catalyst Investment Partners. The firm specializes in developing infill lots, which I just talked a little bit about urban infill, but he specializes in developing infill lots, which include both major renovations of older homes and new construction of homes and townhomes. Mr. Dixon's approach is real estate as a community development tool. He was raised in the city of Atlanta, has a BS in Symbolic Systems from Stanford University, and is a 2017 graduate of the Urban Land Institute's prestigious Center for Leadership. Mike Carthanon is the manager of Research and Analytic Division at the Atlanta Regional Commission and is one of the founders of Neighborhood Nexus, with the goal to foster a data-driven decision-making culture in the Atlanta region and beyond. Mike has worked with numerous community groups, including the Annie E. Casey Foundation, Families First, the United Way, the Community Foundation for Greater Atlanta, and a host of other statewide local education agencies and community groups. And he's also a Decatur resident. Dan Emmergluck is a professor of urban studies at Georgia State University in Atlanta, where his research and teaching concerns housing justice and housing policy, race, real estate, segregation, gentrification, and community development. Among many other things, Dan has been a visiting scholar at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta and a senior fellow at the Center for Community Progress in Washington, D.C. Dan also served on the Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens Transition Committee in 2022, and his most recent book is Red Hot City, Housing, Race, and Exclusion in 21st Century Atlanta. And Dan is also a Decatur resident. Paula Collins had a 10-year stint with the Decatur Education Foundation, where she served 2 years as a chair, founding and current member of the Better Together Advisory Board and member of the Affordable Housing Task Force and chair of the CSD Senior Tax Exemption Committee and a Decatur resident. Maria Pinkleton is the Public Relations Director for the Georgia Council on Developmental Disabilities. In Decatur, she has served on the Lifelong Community Advisory Board, the Decatur Education Foundation Board, the Affordable Housing Task Force, and the Senior Homestead Exemption Commission, and is also a Decatur resident. And Jim Cheeks owns Red Brick Homes, which does business as Fortis Homes, and he's a partner on the Oak Cottage Courts as well. He has more than 20 years experience building and developing homes in the in-town Atlanta market. And since the end of the Great Recession, he's focused on building truly affordable housing and using innovative approaches to achieve his goal. He's currently developing 20 864 square foot units, which will be naturally occurring affordable units, as well as the first duplex with an ADU in the city of Atlanta to provide units at 60% of AMI with no government subsidy. Jim's on the board of directors for Zoo Atlanta and vice chair and chair of the Facilities Committee and member of the Atlanta Welfare Committee. The Animal Welfare Committee. He's an active member of the Greater Home Builders Association, as well as the past president of the Inner Atlanta chapter. From 2003 to 2007, he was a board member of the Atlanta Fulton County Recreation Authority and appointed by former Mayor Shirley Franklin. So we have a great group of panelists tonight. I'll go ahead and stop my share so we can turn over to them for some questions. And so I'll go ahead and have Joel start us off. So can you talk about your view as a developer of missing middle housing types, who they serve, maybe talk about some of your experience in this field, and how you feel about these policy recommendations and how you see them intersecting with other urban planning initiatives, such as mobility, walkability, and traffic.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Great opening, and it's really exciting to see this initiative being brought before what I consider neighbors. As a Atlanta and really Metro resident, I look at everyone as a neighbor, and we have done work in City of Decatur pretty extensively. And so I want to start out there by saying a lot of my progress and what Urban Oasis Development has been doing actually didn't come from me as a real estate developer. It actually came from me as just a normal citizen and neighbor like many of you. I didn't come from a real estate background. I never went back to school for real estate development. I was doing a lot of technology-centered startup work, which is my original background when I moved back to Atlanta from the Bay Area in early 2000s, but was watching neighborhoods that I historically had grown up in. So I was raised here in Atlanta. I remember City of Decatur back in the 80s when they were actually, getting rid of all of this stuff, missing middle and duplex. I remember downtown Atlanta, Old Fourth Ward, Kirkwood, when nobody wanted to touch any of those streets with a 10-foot pole. And so seeing the evolution, though, of those communities and neighborhoods really since 2004, 2005, really brought me into greater context of what it would mean to continue to include other neighbors to be residents in our city and in the city of Decatur. And so I mention that because a lot of what I learned really has just come from very basics. Like, I don't like to use lingo. I just come from saying, this is how my understanding was introduced. The concept of missing middle. And so when we were building in Kirkwood, Eastlake, City of Decatur in 2010, 2011, 2012, we didn't have any concept of this. So once again, I didn't know about missing middle. I wasn't building missing middle. We were doing completely single family only residential, both new construction as well as renovations on 1st Street, 2nd Street, Sutton Street, all across the city of Decatur. And we were doing great work, high quality housing. Everybody loved it. We won home building awards, but we increasingly saw that the price points that we started out building in at $250,000, $300,000 were now $750,000, $800,000, $1 million. And for me, once again, it was kind of like, oh, well, this is great. We launched some streets and we did quality work, but something about it seemed unsustainable. And so that's what really got me thinking about, okay, why is it that we can't seem to have a mixed set of housing options in neighborhoods that I knew historically had a diversity of affordability throughout time? And what I realized is that somebody put it to me in a way that's very simple. Think about vehicles. So we're talking about cars, and many people don't like cars. We know about sustainability and climate change, but just go with me for a second. So in the car and vehicle area, and let's just call it mobility area, we have lots of options, right? So you have folks who are driving SUVs and minivans. We have folks who are driving, you know, four-door sedans. We have folks that are driving two-door sedans. We have folks that are driving or using bicycles and scooters and other public transportation, right? There's a diversity of options when it comes to mobility. So we don't force, you know, an SUV maker to provide affordable SUVs, right? We don't try to subsidize SUVs or vans because we have other options for those who don't need an SUV, right? Like you can choose a more appropriate right-sized vehicle or mobility option. But in the housing side of things, the same thing applies, which is if I only build one type of housing, then I can't expect that to provide a diversity of housing options for everybody who's on this call today. And so once I started understanding that, I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Secondarily, once again, just as a person, a normal human resident, I live in historic Adair Park. I know that there's an Adair Park in Decatur. We actually did work and housing in there. This is the historic neighborhood that's in the city of Atlanta, but very similar to City of Decatur. It's historic homes, a historic neighborhood. I live there on my street. I realized that there were historically 29 units of housing. It included 8 duplexes, 7 single family houses, 2 quads, and a neighborhood elementary school. This is how this neighborhood was developed in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s that we all today protect, right? We have a historic designation that protects all of this stuff. Unfortunately, it didn't protect the missing middle, which is those duplexes or 2-family residential. So we ended up losing 21% of our housing just because of the fact that, one, it became illegal, and then anytime we renovated a house on this street, it became or had to revert to the underlying zoning, which was single family only. I mention this to say it's not comfortable for me, once again, as a normal human, not as a developer, to lose 21% of my neighbors. In addition, on that street, my street that used to be historically in the $200,000 range and is now in the $600,000 range has continued to displace others without, and thankfully, without any missing middle, this street would already be unaffordable for a large swath of everyone on this call. The fortunate thing is that we still have 2 quads, which now provide a lot of the affordable rental options on the street. We have still 2 duplexes that have managed to maintain that provide affordable housing as rental. And then we happen to reconvert that school to provide for 30 different rental micro units. And so I mention all of this to say now as a part of our development, while we still build single family housing because that's important and necessary, our missing middle is that we want to fill in the gap to provide for duplexes and quads because we found that this is going to naturally provide affordability, it's going to naturally provide diversity, and it's going to naturally allow for every type of person on this call to right size fit themselves into a community and a neighborhood. So now let me take off or put to the side, you know, my neighbor and resident hat and say as a developer, what I ended up finding out as well is that it's more expensive and it takes up the same amount of resources, city resources, tax resources to have 1 residential house as it does to have 2 residential houses or 4 units like a quad. Like if you're putting that on a street, if you're including it as a part of your neighborhood, you're actually more efficiently utilizing everything that's already there, whether it's the sewer services, whether it's the police and fire services, somebody's paying the taxes on that, Well, guess what? 4 units and missing middle housing provides better and more of that into the coffers, as Kristen mentioned during her presentation. And so even from a financial resources perspective, in a world and a time where we talk about sustainability, there's nothing more sustainable than better utilizing all of the things that are already under the ground, the utilities, in a way that's very efficient. And what's difficult as a developer, once I started building also bigger stuff, right? 100, 200 unit developments, infill subdivisions that are, 20, 30, 40 homes. I realized how much I have to put in new infrastructure. And while we do that, I just want to give a comparison that as a developer, I know that I could provide those same 20 units put in the midst of the housing as missing middle for much less of the cost and much less of a negative impact, honestly, on the environment. I'm a big proponent of our canopy, of our trees. I've grown up in it. Guess what? It makes me very happy as we're working on a project right now that's going to take a single family lot that we had to take down 2 trees, but for those 2 trees, we're creating 4 units of housing. That housing in a missing middle fashion is actually right sized specifically for seniors. So oftentimes when people are talking about missing middle, they think, oh, this is only for a select few. No, it's for everybody. Seniors want to stay in the city of Decatur. They want to downsize or have an opportunity for ownership or for renter, but they're not being provided. So we're actually doing 4 units there. One is 1,100 square feet. 3 of them are 640 square feet. They're going to be designated for seniors that happen to be in that community, in that neighborhood. We realize that we're able to provide that without subsidy. 3 of those units at 50% area median income, 1 of those units at 100% area median income. In this case, there are actually options for home ownership. And we actually are doing it as a part of the land trust as well. And so we're baking in a lot of things that for me are important. And just to go back on that positive impact for seniors, AARP is one of the biggest proponents of missing middle housing. And their constituents, right? Seniors and those who are experienced, right, in life, who are looking for housing. There's a reason why AARP finds this to be such an important and impactful principle. And the final thing that I'll leave you all with is that in addition to the development role that we do with Urban Oasis Development, I also serve as a faculty member for a nonprofit called Incremental Development Alliance, where we teach and train throughout this country, north, south, east, and west, in neighborhoods, how to do development that can be positively impactful. I just finished one in Hopewell, Virginia, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Minnesota, Charlotte, and we've done ones locally here. And one of the things that we find is that the missing middle is something that everybody can partake in. This does not require me as a developer to come build a duplex or renovate a quad. You as an individual owner or resident of City of Decatur can take over and add positive housing to your neighborhood with very little additional insight input. You don't have to go back and get a degree. And so I will say that that's what also to me is impactful, is that I'm a big proponent that local neighbors do a better job of developing local neighborhoods. I want you all to join alongside of me as a developer who's developing all over the metro area, but I want you to be inclusive of that. And along the way, you can help impact a lot of the areas that Kristen talked about during her presentation.
Thank you, Joel. And yeah, I think those partnerships are so important. And if we're going to move forward on affordable housing in Decatur, we have to have these partnerships. It's such a crucial element. And Jim, I saw you nodding a lot there during the presentation. I don't know if you want to chime in or add anything to that.
No, I think Joel said it everything very perfectly. In fact, my former office was on the street that Joel was talking about, and me and my team marveled at how diverse the housing types were in Adair Park. It looked a lot like your slideshow from the beginning. But no, Joel did a perfect job describing it. I was nodding my head because I was agreeing with everything.
Yeah, thank you. So next we'll move on to Mike with the Atlanta Regional Commission to kind of give us some overall perspective. So Mike, the Atlanta Regional Commission studies the entire metro area. Can you help us understand what's happening at a macro level around housing, age, family size, and why the ARC recommends allowing more housing overall in Metro Atlanta, and kind of how the missing middle is part of that growth strategy and future.
Right. Hey, yeah, thanks, Kristen. And that's a big question. So, I'm going to take kind of a meandering way to answer that question. So, but first, just to make sure we know what the Atlanta Regional Commission is, we are a comprehensive planning agency. We look at all aspects of what makes a community thrive. And that obviously includes housing, transportation, workforce development, and really just anything that you can think of that makes, places successful. Now, in terms of the macro thing, the things that we look at ARC is obviously we're looking way into the future to see, what's the best use of our federal transportation dollars, what's the best use of our investments. But we also just, we're always looking at potential threats. And I think we all sort of look at things, opportunities, weaknesses, strengths, threats. And one of the things that we're looking at in particular is, if you look at Metro Atlanta, we're one of the fastest growing places in America. Last decade, this is from 2010 to 2020, we added about 800,000 new residents, which ranks us fourth, behind Houston, New York, and Dallas. And that's relatively where we've been as a metro area, really for the last 4 decades, somewhere, in the top 5 of growth, somewhere behind New York, Dallas, Houston. But that 800,000 people, that represents a decline in overall growth when compared to previous decades. Like the 90s, for example, we added 1.3 million people. So, and you combine that with the fact that our fertility rates over the past 30, 40 years have really been declining. And so now what we're entering into is just a slower growth, mode altogether, a much slower growth environment. And so this is meandering, I'm getting to a point, but what this means is that we as a region have to work a lot harder now to attract talent. And so, so we either have to attract that talent through in-migration, and we know that in-migration is slowing, or we have to grow that talent natively through our education and workforce development systems. Now, for Metro Atlanta, what has traditionally been one of the primary selling points is affordable housing. We have always had, our housing stock has always been more affordable than almost any other major metropolitan area. And it still is. We haven't lost that competitive advantage yet. But if you look at the areas that contribute the most population to us, so the areas where people are moving from into Atlanta, places like New York, places like Los Angeles, places like Seattle, San Francisco, well, those are some of the most expensive cities in America. Now, so yes, we still have that competitive advantage, but what's happening is folks are moving in from those more expensive cities and bidding up prices here. And so it's making our housing stock less affordable, which means that competitive advantage we have is quickly eroding. And so that's one of the things that we at ARC really look at and, kind of look at in the horizon. And that's a major threat to us remaining competitive, to us remaining a thriving, vibrant region when compared to some of our peers that we compete with. Now, at the same time, while that population growth is slowing, it's also just the composition of that growth is changing. We're becoming older and we're becoming more diverse. And so when we're looking out into the future, we're looking at the simple fact that in this region, we're going to have more than 1 million residents who are 75 years and older. So just bounce that around in your head a little bit. We're going to have around 1 million people who are 75 years or older by the year 2050. And this is just something as a society we've never really had to grapple with. So what that means is, we have to be very, very intentional in what our communities look like. And we have a term for it at ARC. It's called lifelong communities. That's also kind of another way of describing missing middle housing. Because, what the idea behind lifelong communities is, well, as the name suggests, you can live there throughout your entire life. You can grow up there. You can go to school. You can live in a house and go to school there. You can graduate out of that school system, go off to college, come back as, somebody with an entry-level job and live in that same community. You can grow old in that community. And you have all the services and all the amenities and all the different types of housing that you'll need throughout your entire lifetime. Now, for the city of Decatur, and I've lived here for 12 years now, but been in Metro Atlanta for about 20 years. Decatur already has all these amenities. It's already one of the more walkable places. It already has transit systems. It already has a lot of those things that we talk about with that lifelong community concept. What we don't have is the actual housing stock. We don't have that diversity of housing. We don't have that missing middle. And so, when you look at the city of Decatur, we're pretty close to kind of, one of our big policy areas is that lifelong communities, and the city of Decatur is pretty close. We're just missing the housing part. Now let's talk about housing a little bit, because again, at ARC, we're in the business of looking into the future and identifying threats. And a few years ago, and time is so abstract these days, but it was probably 5 years ago, we went through this big community engagement process where we really focused on economic development and economic development professionals around the region. And we did the same thing that you typically do in these type of convenings. You do your SWOT analysis, you look at your threats, and what we heard from the economic development community was surprising. Well, not necessarily the findings, but it was just surprising to hear it coming from the economic development community that affordable housing is the #1 threat. And so if you're seeing, we've been sounding the alarm bells about affordable housing at ARC for a long, long time. But once you start hearing economic developers saying, hey, man, it's getting harder for us to attract businesses here because their workers can't find housing. When you hear the CEOs of companies like Atlanta Gaslight saying, I can't find, administrative assistants because they have to drive 2 hours. So that became, a big red button in front of us. It's like, okay, we have to figure this out. And so, that's why, we started the regional housing strategy. We've developed that. So I encourage you to go to ARC and, Google some combination of Metro Atlanta housing strategy. And you'll see that we've divided up the region into different submarkets based on, mostly price, but also kind of land use, land cover. We have different strategies for different types of communities, but the real value of this is working with our local governments and our local elected leaders and trying to give them some tools, trying to give them some best practices, some tactics that they can, be creative in how to solve this. It's not even a looming affordability crisis anymore. The crisis is here about how we can help each other solve this regional crisis that we have in terms of affordable housing. So in housing overall, it really boils down to just a few things. And this is reflected in our regional housing strategy. #1, you've got to increase supply, right? If you look at the levels of inventory, if you look at the levels of housing starts that we've had in the last 10 years, it is at the lowest levels that we've seen in decades. We're just not introducing enough supply. So #1, increase supply. However you can do that, the more affordable, the better. #2, we have to preserve the supply of affordable housing that we have today. If you look, every year the census data comes out and we're losing more and more units that are being rented for less than $1,000 a month or less than $1,250 a month, whatever level of affordability that you think of, we're having fewer and fewer of that every single year. So we have to do a better job at preserving what we have, whether that's naturally occurring or whether that's subsidized. We need to preserve that. A third thing is we just have to reduce costs altogether. And that, there's a variety of things to think about with that. And that includes transportation. So a lot of folks who can, get a good deal in housing, well, they give it back away in their commute. And, as we're returning to office more and more, commutes are beginning to matter again. So a fourth thing is, we need to ensure housing stability. We need to make sure that people who are in their particular housing situation, it may not be the most affordable situation, but that family is making it work. We need to make sure that we're not making it harder for them to stay. So we have to promote that housing stability. A fifth thing is we really have to get more money in the housing ecosystem. We have to expand capital resources for nonprofit developers, for local governments. We have to think about sort of gap financing, however we can make the terms work. We just have to get more money into building and preserving housing. And this brings me to the final thing that we're talking about. And that is, we need to develop local leadership around these issues. And that just means, we have to be bold. We have to be courageous. And I'm not talking about just the top elected leaders. I'm talking about grassroots and grass tops. We have to be creative. We have to really work together, and we have to understand that if we don't start taking concrete, intentional steps to create a more affordable housing stock, well, all you have to do is look back at San Francisco about 30, 40 years ago, where their median household or their median home price was around 280, 290, 300. Of course, I'm not adjusting for inflation. And then look at San Francisco today. If we continue to do nothing, I guarantee you in 20, 30 years, we're going to be looking back and it's like, how in the heck did we turn into San Francisco? And so that's, my meandering answer to that big question, Kristen.
Thank you,
So I'll
Mike.
stop there.
Yeah, that was great. And that was a great view of kind of the Atlanta metro area and some of it touching on Decatur. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Maria, because I want to bring the discussion more specifically to Decatur at this point. And you served on the Affordable Housing Task Force, which added a specific recommendation to re-allow missing middle as one of the 23 recommendations in the task force report as part of kind of this broader picture of affordable housing. So I just want to talk a little bit about how you view Decatur in the housing and just the different situations of living in Decatur over your time as a resident and as a member of the task force. Why do you think that missing middle was chosen as one of the recommendations?
So once again, I'm Maria Pinkleton. I have lived in Decatur. We moved here in October of 2011 when we were still those prices that Michael just spoke of back in the before times. And we moved from Midtown Atlanta with our 1-year-old, moved from a 1-bedroom condo to find more space, landed in a townhome here in the Claremont Great Lakes neighborhood, and definitely loved the fact that Decatur had access to MARTA, and it was technically right down Ponce, and had shops and restaurants, walkability that we're familiar with through our time living in Midtown. I will say that we know how lucky we were, and our friends that moved here around the same time or a little bit before that realize how lucky we were to jump into Decatur at that time. My role with the Affordable Housing Task Force has been informed by my day job role at the Georgia Council on Developmental Disabilities, another group of diverse people, of diverse Georgians that need housing, as well as my time on the Lifelong Living Advisory Board for the City of Decatur. We've tried prior to this iteration of an Affordable Housing Task Force plan. There have been iterations before this, and so many people ask, what's different about this one? And what I think is most different is basically Kristen Allen being here. She was one of the items on our list. You need to hire someone. And it is as if I don't even remember how many people are part of that task force, but we did this collective push, this brain dump, and came up with 23 recommendations, many of which are either complete or in progress. And when you look at them, you see that we were trying to get it from every angle. Looking at missing middle and why we added reallowing the missing middle types of housing into that list of recommendations was because it was one of our largest points of bleed, for lack of a better term. Looking at the map and seeing how many quads and duplexes and naturally occurring affordable smaller homes were in our communities, they were going away at such a fast rate because everyone wanted to cash in, and you can't blame someone from wanting to make money on the boom that is the housing market in our country. But we knew that using tactics or using rules that flipped the script and took us back to a time when these options, like a street like Drexel, were openly available, was one way in which we could really stop the halt and bring affordability and options and diversity into Decatur's market. There were other recommendations that we made to the city that have supported, say, seniors, like the extension of our MLK service project is now a year-round project. That is something that our liaison with the Lifelong Living Advisory Board, Leanne Harvey, that is her baby. And that was making sure that seniors were always available or always able to get the services that they needed to stay in their houses. Other recommendations like the Decatur Land Trust creation, developing impact fees, looking at mandatory inclusionary housing, have all been tools that we've been able to use that have impacted my neighbors. It's impacted the students that, in my role at Decatur Education Foundation, we're able to serve. There is a very whole effect in this community to the whole list of recommendations that we put together. I think that Decatur is very different in that we are this tiny little place. We are not Atlanta, right? Atlanta's huge. We are 4 square miles and some change. And unlike my visits to Amsterdam, Amsterdam just is literally digging dirt out of the water to create more land. We can't do that here. So the more innovative that we are able to get in zoning, the more innovative we're able to get with rental assistance programs, we will be able to change the trajectory so that we're not ending up in a space where we're San Francisco, and where most of us are priced out of our communities. I did want to mention, I know at the beginning of our evening in Kristen's presentation, she had a slide with a quote from Commissioner Walsh on it, saying that we need to be in a mindset of I support affordable housing and not I support affordable housing, but there have been many voices that I've heard and listened to and understood where they were coming from, that would say, I like affordable housing, but does it have to be across the street from me? I like affordable housing, but I don't want my house value to crash. As you guys saw, the images that were shown before the presentation started of houses that are here in Decatur. There's several of them that are along, I know on Claremont, off of Claremont, that are those houses. And they are amazing homes. And even though there is a split level down the street from me that I think has 4 apartments in it, houses on my street still sell for like $950 and $1 million. So that split level that has four affordable units in it is not doing a dent on what our market is seeing. We really need to keep in mind that if we don't act now and look at things like the Decatur Housing Trust Fund, look at things like the Decatur Land Trust, look at different options that are, that are options for us, that are options for our very unique and individual set of issues, we will not be successful in this endeavor. And there are multiple people that that I know, that were in the video that the Affordable Housing Task Force had developed that can't live here. And they are our people. The teacher in the video, Beverly Byer, my son just started Renfro this year, or now Beacon Hill Middle School. That is his science teacher. These are our people. These are our friends, our firefighters, our cops, our teachers that cannot afford to live here. And so we are in a situation where we have an opportunity to make change, to keep our people with us, and to bring in more of our people, and to keep Decatur a diverse and wonderful place that we can all enjoy together.
Thank you, Maria. Yeah, sometimes I go to community meetings where people say, well, I think Decatur has missed the boat. And I said, well, in some ways, maybe we have, but what do we do? Do we just say, well, we've missed the boat and we're not going to do anything? Or do we look at the task force plans that are laid out for us and try to move forward? And that's what I think we need to do. So next, I'm going to turn it over to Dan. So Dan has so much extensive experience in housing and history of housing around the country. And maybe briefly, just if you can explain why you think missing middle housing was disallowed in areas around the country, kind of what the catalyst could be for that. And then Maria already talked a little bit about this, but housing and its impact, affordable housing and its impact on property values. And then lastly, maybe some state preemptions. A lot of times I hear people saying, well, why can't Decatur just keep the rent affordable? And there are certain things that the city can't do that the state preempts. So if you can maybe give us a little bit of information around that, that would be great.
Sure. Thanks, Kristen. It's great to be here. It's also, I've lived in Decatur almost 20 years, and I had a student at Tech when I was at Tech, and his paper for my housing policy class was, I want to write about a small suburb and what it should do about affordable housing. And I said, well, you should pick a suburb. You should think about that suburb because every housing policy is contextual. And he picked Decatur. And it was a very good paper. And then he sent it to the city. And then they hired him, and this was 10 years ago. And the 3 core ideas in that paper and in his little analysis that he followed on with for the city was a community land trust, cottage courts, and inclusionary zoning. So it's really good to see these things come to fruition. He didn't touch so much, I mean, cottage courts is a type of missing middle, of course. But he didn't touch so much on kind of 1 to 4. And since then, of course, upzoning 1 to 4 from single family only to 1 to 4 units is definitely a national trend in the last 5 years. Kristen talked about it. I think the downzoning, I see downzoning is happening in 2 phases. One in large central cities, in older central cities in the 50s and 60s, and then another wave, especially in the South, but also in a lot of suburbs in the 80s. And the thing that they both have in common, I think, is a reaction or a fear of decline, a fear of a fear of racial transition and efforts to exclude people in ways that would still be legal. And zoning is basically can be a way to exclude people. And in 1968, a week after Dr. King was assassinated, Johnson got the Fair Housing Act adopted and signed it. And then 20 years later, in 1988, the Fair Housing Act was strengthened quite dramatically. And it really outlawed all kinds of ways to discriminate in housing markets, to keep Black people out of your neighborhood. But the one thing that it hasn't effectively done is fight what's called exclusionary zoning. And it could actually, if it were, in my opinion, if it were enforced and you had courts that were friendly to the Fair Housing Act, which we mostly don't right now, it could be used to fight, and it has been in some cases. But mostly zoning has been kind of the last vestige of exclusion in lots of communities. And I think that's what happened in the 1980s. The fear of racial transition, people, basically the transition that happened in the Oakhurst neighborhood, there were fears that that would spread to other parts of the city, and zoning was seen, basically down zoning to single family only was a scene of keeping people out. Now we've come full circle and maybe we don't want to keep people out so much. And of course, the price of housing has interacted with that exclusion. Now we're not just excluding by race, but we're excluding by class. And in Decatur's case, we are becoming, since I came here, I tell my students when we read about this trend called super gentrification, which is when middle-class communities become ultra affluent, I point them to Decatur. It seems to me to be one of the best examples in the metro. So I think if we want to talk about diversity and talk about inclusion, we have to recognize that, the 80s, the 70s and the 80s were a time of urban stress. The 80s were, of course, the crack epidemic in cities, causing a lot of urban problems in Atlanta and other places. And people wanted, it reinforced whatever racism was there was kind of amplified. So I do think that was part of that problem. The other piece of this is the 1986 Tax Act, which really changed, this is in the weeds, it reduced the amount of depreciation that developers could take on residential housing. And so if you look at a chart of multifamily development over time, it kind of falls off a cliff after 1986, just in terms of market rate development. And so there was a lot of kind of disinvestment going on in multifamily, especially small multifamily. And the other thing that was happening was if you were going to do multifamily in the 80s, you were going to do big multifamily. So, why you see a lot of multifamily in the suburbs in Atlanta is because it was, the investors were pulling out of small multifamily and moving into large multifamily. And of course, Decatur didn't have the space too much for the large multifamily. The question about property values is one that has, if I had to pick a housing topic that has been over-researched, it's been, what is the effect on affordable housing on my property values, meaning on single-family home values? And time again, it's brought up in terms of opposing multifamily housing, opposing affordable housing. It's what I and others call a zombie myth. The research is pretty clear. whatever effects multifamily or subsidized multifamily has on single family home values, they're very small. Sometimes they're positive. Some of the research finds positive effects, especially given that in recent years, most subsidized multifamily is low-income housing tax credit development. And those developments are quite nice. They appear very nice on the outside. They're very well built. The standards are very high. But even the research that shows negative impacts, and there are a few studies out there, they're like 1%, 0.5% of home value. They're very small. And right now, maybe we could do with some negative effects on home values. But there is no good evidence. On the other hand, if you upzone a parcel, going back to what Joel was saying, you will generate more value on that particular parcel, right? So the appraised value by the assessor will be higher because there are 3 or 4 units there instead of 1. But that value is divided by 3 or 4. So each unit will be cheaper than a single family unit. It's just that the total land value now will be higher, right? So actually land values could go up a little bit, even if the unit value goes down, the price you would have to pay for a unit. The last question that Kristen asked was about what can cities do in Georgia or counties? And I'm afraid the answer is not a whole lot. This is not a strong home rule state, particularly when it comes to real estate. And the state has not delegated the authority to regulate real estate transactions in general, particularly landlord-tenant relationships, or mortgage relationships, mortgagee relationships. Those are the domain of state law. And the few times I've been here for a while, so I've seen DeKalb County try to regulate vacant properties that banks own, for example. As soon as they tried that, the legislature jumped on it and stopped it. So this is also a state, until the legislature changes, will jump in to preempt if it isn't already clearly preempted. So there is no option for local rent control. There's explicit prohibition against it. You cannot even require landlords to accept housing vouchers. The City of Atlanta has such a law on the books. It passed a few years ago. It's not enforceable because the state fair housing law preempts it. You could not pass a law that protects LGBTQ people from housing discrimination. The state law would preempt that. So we need a different state legislature, different governor to attack those. But also going back to Mike Carnathan's comment, we also need local officials to organize around the state to put pressure on their state legislators to call for changes. Because that, in my opinion, that's the only way it's going to happen. If mayors, city council people say, we want local control over these issues, because Republicans are supposed to be big on local control, but they won't cede it on these issues.
Really helpful, Dan. Thank you.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, great. So the next person we're going to go to is Jim. So Jim's a developer. Jim and Joel are our 2 developers on the call, and I wanted to talk to Jim a little bit so we can get an idea as a group about what some real life examples look like of a developer developing missing middle housing, what that might look like in Decatur. Could they be owned versus rented? And then after Jim, we'll follow up with Paula, and that will end our discussion. So go ahead, Jim.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Mayor Garrett and to Angela and Kristen. You've done a great job. The slides were very well thought out, very well put together. Really enjoy hearing everybody else speak and can't wait for Paula to speak next. So I won't give you the long 20-year history of our company, but we're really focused on building unsubsidized affordable housing. And you know, your direct question about developing a quad, it means a lot of different things, right? You can, as Joel said, you can, a layperson, a non-builder type, could do this type of development. It is able to be done from an affordable standpoint. It's able to be done from a regular market rate perspective. But regardless, you are able to increase supply. And we've heard a number of people talk about supply and you know, having 4 on 1, obviously we can all do that math really easily. We do, our business is sort of broken up into 2. One is we develop about 15 to 20% of our projects annually that we keep and then we rent them out. The rest is just pure construction and for sale. So in the multi-units, everything's 4 or less that we do. I find, quite frankly, that it is a very lucrative market, even at affordable, even with affordable rents. But not many of my compatriots do. I'm the past president of the Untitled Chapter of the Home Builders Association, and almost all of those gals and guys laugh at me. They think my business is silly, and so I kind of like that. But in terms of renting versus being able to sell, a quad is a bit different. It is a little bit harder of a structure to condoize a 4-unit development than it is a 40-unit development. The legal fees that are associated with that and the maintenance requirements are a bit more difficult to do in a 4-unit. So I don't think you'll see a whole lot of those from a for sale perspective. It could be something that the city could maybe have some pro bono legal work that would help a development pencil out. Just an idea. But the question of who benefits from this, it's really everyone, right? It's the neighbor next door to what potentially was a derelict 4-bedroom that fell in disrepair, and then it you know, the market says, okay, just tear that down and build a super gentrification, as we heard. That might not be the best thing that the neighbor who's lived there for 30 years and bought it, you know, $150,000 would like to see. So again, it's an option thing. I think obviously the people who were to rent or potentially buy a unit of that size will be able to live in Decatur more easily. And one statistic I like to quote is in 1970, the average home size was 970 square feet and 2.4 people lived in that home. In 2020, it was 2,550 square feet and 2.2 people lived in that home. And when you think about it like that, it's not only a supply issue, but it's the size, right? Everybody wanted bigger. I will admit, I live in a pretty big house. But where we're able to do unsubsidized affordable housing is just smaller. In the city of Atlanta specifically, you've got a lot of very small lots. In fact, I'm building on a lot right now. A lot of record, I didn't change anything. 20 by 52 feet. The lot, not the house. The lot is 20 by 52 feet. That is going to be a roughly 900 square foot house. And in the neighborhood that it is in, which is a pretty nice neighborhood, that house is probably going to sell for about $450,000. Now, people say, Jim, I thought you were the affordable builder. Well, I am, because everything else in the neighborhood is 6 and up. And then Kristen wanted to potentially give some examples about tiny homes. And I really hate the term tiny home, specifically because of that statistic that I just mentioned. We were the builder on the Cottages on Vaughan project, and one of them was particularly small. Most of them were a little over 500 square feet and a loft that didn't count towards the square footage. That cottage court is allowing 8 people to have bought anywhere from $180,000 to $250,000 last year, right? Last year, not 20 years ago like Maria, or however long. Maybe didn't get the year right, but you get my point. And it is an efficient. It was a single family lot, and there are 8 homes on it now. In fact, again, I'm kind of ashamed to admit that you could fit almost all of those houses in my house, in my one little house, or my one big house, I guess I should say. So I understand there's anxiety. I go to neighborhood meetings where I'm asking people, can I please go from a single family to a duplex or this or that? I get the anxiety, but in every neighborhood in Atlanta, I'm most focused in Atlanta. I live in Atlanta. My mom lives in Decatur. But in almost every neighborhood where people want to be, Joel mentioned Old Fourth Ward. He could have mentioned Inman Park. All of those neighbors, Virginia Highlands, everywhere where people have wanted to live, have incredible housing choice, right? Summerhill is a neighborhood that was in incredible disrepair. It's where I got my start 20 years ago. There is a 60-unit public housing project, and this is very low income. It is between 30 and 50% AMI. And people can't wait to get into Summerhill. Those houses are $500,000, $600,000, $700,000, $800,000. So what I tell people when they think, Dan, maybe you can use this for your class, but I tell people that say, oh no, my property value is going to go down. I say, well, tell that to the people who are bidding up the prices in Summerhill, and they're across the street from a 60-unit public housing project. And by the way, there's 100 habitat like homes that were built in the 90s in Summerhill as well. And most of them are still there. So, the economics of it is sound from a developer standpoint. While we are a for-profit developer, we're very, very mission driven, and we're doing quite well. And again, we're building predominantly unsubsidized, affordable housing. So, I think the last thing I'd like to say is one of Kristen's slides earlier talked about Portland and Minneapolis. Missing middle, roughly 9% each. It's my understanding, and these numbers are probably 5-6 months old, but since 2017, when the city of Atlanta allowed ADUs, there have been about 80 built in 5 years. I built, I think, 8 of them. Got another 8 in the ground right now. This is not going to be the sea change that a lot of people might fear. Unfortunately, quite frankly, they're very difficult to finance. That may be changing. Fannie Mae is doing some pilot projects, is my understanding. But the term gentle density is one that I hope you can come away from this housing forum and doing your own research. It truly is. Missing middle is gentle. Again, you all live in the people that are actually residents. While it was outlawed in 1988, you've got quite a bit of housing mix, and you wanted to live here, and you still want to live here, and you want your kids to live here. So I don't see this as being something that's going to shake things up so much in Decatur and be a negative.
Thank you,
That's kind of my spiel, and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you, Jim. And so we'll wrap up the forum with Paula. She's going to go through a few things that have come in on questions from the community, some misnomers that we hear. And one is that renters don't pay property taxes, which is not true. Another is that owner-occupied housing is not subsidized. So she'll talk a little bit about the homestead exemptions. And then you can just wrap us up after that, Paula.
Okay. well, first off, it's kind of interesting being the closer on this one, but I have enjoyed hearing everybody else, and I'm grateful I live in a city that cares about this. So yeah, I'm going to do a little myth busting. One, that renters don't pay property taxes. I love this one. This makes me lick my lips. I'm going to use an example that's literally next door to us. I live at the Artisan, downtown Decatur. I've been in downtown now for 10 years. I lived in a neighborhood a half mile from here for the, I don't know, I guess 11 years before that. So I've been around for a while. But I want to look at 1133 on the square, which was formerly the Alexan. There are 167 units there, of which 75% of them are studio or one bedroom. So let's think about that for a moment. Definitely not a strain on the schools, right? And apparently a lot of people use MARTA because I see a constant parade of people in the morning walking down Marshall Street, headed down to the train station. The current posted lowest rent for a one bedroom is about $2,000 a month. And that's not including utilities, insurance. That's just base rent. So a lot of people cannot afford that. So that's the first piece of this puzzle. The other is that so I looked at the 1133 was finished in 2016 and started becoming populated that year. So the prior value of that land was just north of, it was around $3 million. Now it's just under 40 million. So we're seriously adding to commercial portion of our tax base anytime one of these apartment buildings or anything like it gets, stands up. But in 2020, that building alone paid about $700,000 into the general fund of the city of Decatur. That's about $4,000 a unit. And as Kristen alluded, it's built into the rental rates. It's not, they're paying rent, they're just not paying a tax, or they're paying taxes, they're just not paying a tax bill directly. So anybody who wants to think about it that way, renters they don't pay property taxes, but the homeowner or whoever owns that property is definitely going to pay it. So they don't get any tax breaks, they get no homestead exemptions, nothing like that. So renters don't pay property taxes. Nah. Good one, but not quite. Owner occupied housing is not subsidized. Based on just the city of Decatur's homestead exemptions that property exemptions, this past year amounted to about $1.8 million that did not go into the general fund, and that's not including the school. That number to me pales in comparison to what, and first let me back up. I'm grateful that the city is putting money in now into the Decatur House, the trust fund, but $1.8 million does not exactly equate $100,000, which is what, again, I'm grateful the city's been budgeting for that in the past few years. But for any homeowner who's owner occupied and wants to think they're not subsidized, Decatur's like pretty much every other city in this country. This is possibly my favorite out of this, which was, will this policy ruin the fabric of Decatur's neighborhoods? Right. So as Kristen mentioned earlier, the city of Decatur participates every other year in the National Citizen Survey. And in 2008, the question about the availability of affordable quality housing, half the respondents gave an excellent or good rating. 2008. In 2020, the same question was asked and it flipped on its head, with half people answering giving that a poor rating. So people who live here are cognizant and very aware that we have a problem. It's not news, it's just we're finally doing something about it. Our citizens also recognize the issue of affordability and its link to diversity. And that's socioeconomic, racial, any flavor of diversity you want to think about. Cities change and grow in response to a lot of factors. The city, like I said, I've been here a long time. The city has changed substantially. In some very good ways and other ways that make me scratch my head. I've listened to two of these, to Dan and to Jim, talk about effect on property values. When I stand up on the pool deck and look down Commerce and wave at my friends at the Housing Authority and all those properties down there, trust me, they are not dragging our property values down, not at all. Neither are the apartments or the hotel or anything else is being built around us. And Dan actually, I think, did a nice job of highlighting Oakhurst and how I mean, that's just tremendous change. I get lost now. I have to use my phone to drive around Oakhurst. It's sad, but all my landmarks are just gone. So when we think about all the changes that have happened, and we think about this changing back to allowing duplex, tris, quads, the same 2020 National Citizen Survey, before Kristen started her educational outreach on this rezoning project, there was substantial support, 64% as a matter of fact. So many of our neighbors don't think that this is going to have a negative effect on our neighborhoods. The city saw it as a way to try to address the missing middle, but still have some sense of control over design and standards. So admittedly, this concept of rezoning and reverting basically is just one piece in a very big puzzle. The Affordable Housing Task Force truly understood that it's going to take a lot of pieces of the puzzle, and this is just one of them. And so I would like to ask simply, instead of asking why wouldn't we do this, why wouldn't we reinstate this? It just seems to make a lot of sense, and I don't see pushback. I see people with questions. I hope we've addressed a number of them this evening. And the last piece for me is, as Kristen asked me as a downtown Decatur neighbor, why do I think that there's need for smaller units, whether it's rentals or ownership in the neighborhoods? And the answer is very simple. Not everybody's cut out to live in downtown. We can ask George Dusenberry, who used to be my neighbor here and now is a neighbor in a neighborhood probably a quarter mile from here. He's experienced both. There are pros and cons to all of it, but not everybody wants to live here in downtown, and we should be spreading this throughout our city. We had it once, we should try to return it. With that, I will say thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Paula. And we had one question come in from the chat. Would the new missing middle construction be subject to the same standards with respect to the tree ordinances and impermeable surface? And that's yes, would be the same, would apply to these multi-units as would a single family home. And the last question is, will this be, this has been recorded, will this be available? And this recording will be available. You can view it or forward it to anyone that's interested. It's www.decaturga/affordable housing. And I just wanted to thank everyone for coming and for your time, and to our wonderful panelists for painting a picture of this. I know the community will probably still have more questions. You can go on the Affordable Housing webpage and email me, or I can come out and do a little talk with your community members, your neighbors, or book club, or whatever it may be. So thank you again, and please reach out with any questions. Good night.